Hi, welcome back to part 2 of my chat with Tom Waterman from Audient. So we spoke a little bit about the triangle of tone.
You say it exactly how I used to say it. So it has an effect on you already, right?
I might have to put some echo on that in post, but let's actually dive in a little bit to what it means. We talk about semantics, and we talk about, we use all these terms in the studio all the time, you know, sort of dark and light and muddy and airy, and so let's try and put that into some kind of context with regard to what we record.
Yeah.
Obviously, being a drummer, I'm going to dive in with drums first.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, I mean, how do you begin? You start to look at opposites and things you like.
Effectively, yeah, and you have to have a reference point. You know, as a case in point, I had one engineer that always chucks an SM57 up first on everything with the same mic pre, because that's their reference point. You know, they slap it on the snare drum, on the guitar amplifier, and just have a listen to it. And if they know that it's not cracking enough, or there's not enough bite, then they might decide from that sort of starting point where to go. You know, do they go to a harder microphone, a softer microphone? Do they change the tuning of the drum? And effectively, this triangulation, or this triangular tone, is just a way of like visualizing that, so you could learn it, digest it. If it just helps kind of figure out, effectively, what we're trying to do as engineers, I think, is take the source, capture it and mold it so that it matches your creative vision or the vision of somebody else if you're just engineering for them. And you have to understand your tools quickly to do that job. You know, it's not sort of load up 20 plugins and play until you stumble across the fat snare drum sound. You have to know, okay, to make the snare fatter, we're gonna maybe tune it differently. Maybe we're gonna, try changing the type of snare head. You know, you might go with like more of a fiber skin instead of like
one ply rather than two.
Absolutely, yeah. Maybe it's, change the hoops, or definitely pitch related stuff, resonant and batter head relationships, that kind of thing. Or it might be the mic pre that you pick, and that's what this thing's all about, really.
So this is definitely as much about being a good producer or producer stroke engineer, and interpreting someone's audio their audio likes, what they imagine for the song or the production, whatever it is, as much as it is about turning knobs and making sounds and...
Well, yeah, I would say it's about being fast, isn't it? It's about understanding your tools. You need to know, if you need to solve a problem, which piece is going to do that quickly. And you can play around. I think the studio should have some element of creative exploration. That's really, what it's all about. And to be honest, these days, where you're not necessarily on a day budget and you have to be kicked out at 10 p.m, you can kind of continue to explore. But that doesn't mean maybe that you shouldn't sort of try and train yourself almost like an athlete, to go on the B of the bang, like Linford Christie used to say, and make sure you do the job quickly. So that's where this comes from. It's really a way of just mapping out all the tools. Like I don't use it so much as a personal tool, but I think about my gear semantically, or feel based, whether it's, does it make things feel angry, or does it make things feel like more relaxed? Is a compressor really good at relaxing a bass part, or does it make it funk a little harder, give it a bit more groove? And they're all semantic terms, and if you couple them all together, and that's how you describe your gear. If you talk to mastering engineers, their one thing is they pick pieces in the chain so they complement each other, so that if they have a really colourful X, they don't necessarily have another one that's got the same sort of imprint, so that the end result is little portions of everything all working together. And that's how we can use the sort of triangle to map out the differences. So if we start with your snare example, we'll go with, let's say you've got a snare drum and it's not particularly coming to life yet on the mic, and you could look at the tuning, how you change the snare sound. What would you do? If you were trying to make a funk record, where would you go to make a funk snare? What would you do?
Well, I'd definitely, first of all, I'd be looking at making it a nice tight sound, like sort of snappy, sharp.
So to do that, you'd maybe tune up, go up a good couple of like semitones on
a good couple of turns on each key. I'd probably look at some damping to try and get rid of any ring, because it's not, you don't want that big kind of sort of rock sound. You want a nice snap.
Yeah, almost like a side stick enhanced with a skin, effectively.
And then I suppose you'd look at how that sound is then affected, be it like lots of top end, lots of bottom end, sort of highs and lows, things like that. You maybe find a frequency where it's really nice and there's the punches there.
You want some pop, yeah.
Yeah,
exactly.
Too much bottom end or too much rumble.
Yeah, and it's funny because that whole 3 sentences is just semantics, 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 and you've discussed tuning the snare, EQing the snare, maybe miking the snare, potentially how you hit the snare. That's in one sentence a lot of information to sort of dissect as a new engineer, effectively, or someone learning the trade. So if we took a look at, say, the triangle of tones that we've got up on the board so far, in the snare one, which we've got in blue here, we've marked, effectively, it's an opposites game, and you don't have to use this. Like I tend to use numbers, but if you're not, you want to just dabble with it instead.
Any further than 4 and I'm lost, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I used to do like 0 in the middle, and then you get 10 on each side, so effectively 10 and minus 10. So if something was really edgy, that's plus 10. If it was the opposite of edgy and therefore dull, then it would be minus 10. And it's trying to sort of strip away lots and lots of choices and lots of semanticism, effectively, to just have maybe 6 different 3 opposites, so 3 pairs of opposites, which allow you to sort of map roughly where you need to be really quickly. And if you learn your gear, then you know all the techniques you apply, you know how to do that. So, in your case, we might just say that, over here right on the edge is just super tight. That's really tuned up, in terms of the skins. Well cranked, which you can argue is also the same as high, but, you don't necessarily have to tune both skins on the drum to the same pitch. So, a tight skin isn't necessarily always going to be, super, super high pitch, depending on whether you've just made the bottom tight or the top tight.
Absolutely.
So, in your case, for a funk drum, you might say you want it to be really tight up here. You want it to be quite damped, so it didn't have much ring, for example. So you maybe say, for a really funky drum, it's somewhere over here. And then you're going to want it to be more high in pitch because it's maybe more of a hip hop backbeat, so it's more of a crack.
Yeah.
And you leave room for a big kick drum. So you come up here, and that's just some amount of high. It doesn't have to be like a scale or anything. And then you triangulate a funk drum, poorly drawn, sitting down, but you've got that as your triangle of information. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Poorly drawn and shaded in by myself. So that's your funk drum over there. But then let's say, someone comes in and says, right, we're doing an 80s pop ballad. And you're going nice, slow, 80 BPM, boof.
I want a nice, big, loose, fat
drum.
Yeah.
So,
with a lot of ring and a lot of, it's got to go, you almost want the opening of Purple Rain.
Exactly, yeah. And, that might come from the way you tune it, the snare drum, the snare heads you put on the drum, the type of drum. Maybe you go to a wooden drum at that point, or maybe go like a nice 14 by 6.5 with wiggle end at 14 by 8 or something. Yeah. It could come from the reverb you apply, like an AMS nonlinear or some kind of really dirgy. Like what's the big famous trick is the eventide pitch shifted reverb, isn't it? The H3000 pitch down reverb. So that you would effectively your goal as an engineer is to take these terms really and decipher that as quickly as possible and employ any of these tricks to get that job done. So in your case, for a big ballad snare, you'd want more ring over here. We want it to be loose or tight. Loose could mean the snare wire.
Yeah,
in this case.
It could mean that, or it could mean the head. Obviously, it's
variables.
Yeah, whatever's working for the song is probably what we should be saying. But
that's sort of the goal, isn't it? It's taking what is the source and figuring out the best way of shaping that.
I would probably still go. It's a kind of a looser head because you want that big,
precisely,
sound, deeper
and
sound.
we're probably going to tune it down somewhat. So then you end up with a triangle that sits opposites. And the nice thing with this is if you think about it from an arrangement point of view and doing what's right for the song as a producer, not just as an engineer, then if that's where your snare drum's going, then you need to think about where your bass guitar is going to sit in reference to that, because it's now going to occupy some of the low end of where the snare sits. And all the tricks you see people talk about, well, if you boost this part of a frequency on this sound, you cut in another one to make space. The triangle is effectively showing you that space visually and allowing you to do it at micro level on like a small thing, like the type of condenser mic you use on the hi-hat or something,
There was a term that was being thrown around when I was at university, which was spectrum mixing.
Okay, yeah.
So basically, if your bass guitar was here, nothing else should be in that range. You could put your kick drum below it, you could put your kick drum above it. Your guitars and your vocals, the classic case with rhythm guitars is that it's such that middle range. You want to maybe get your guitars out, scoop out of the middle to let your vocals sit in there. And actually, you listen to those parts in isolation, it sounds pretty awful.
Yeah.
As a mix and as a balance, And again, there's two words that we use all too often that can be misconstrued: a mix or a mix and a balance.
Yeah.
Somehow it works. Sometimes it doesn't work.
No, I think balancing is sort of overlooked these days. You know, mixing is parallel processing, and you know, lots of processing, lots of everything. But balance is effectively balance. You know, it's just relative things between each source or the two or more elements you have. And faders are a great way of doing that. You know, because on a console, I think people soloed less. Whereas now, when obviously you solo, it'd be unusual to sort of take a massive amount of 800 hertz out of a guitar. It just sounds really, really scooped. And then in the mix with a vocal fighting to come through there and a solo, like a lead guitar, that might really work. But if you to solo it and do that EQ move, you wouldn't do so. So, you know, effectively, and it's funny you mention that because these charts, they sort of came from a way. I was talking to somebody about a concept for something new, which is effectively a visual solo. So I might as well say that on camera. But
yeah.
You know, when you hit solo on a track, sometimes you do it just to find out whether something's fighting something else. So you solo the bass and the kick. But what if the audio didn't ever solo? It just soloed, you know, a visual representation of where they might be interacting, and then you can choose orally whether you want to override that or not, effectively.
In some kind of graphical interfacey type.
Yeah, or imagine even just a triangle. You know, it could be moving, and it could show you where the bass is stepping on the kick, and you go, yeah, but I really like that. That's what makes this work right now. Whereas it's all too easy to try and like default to just keeping them separate and carving stuff away. And sometimes it's the rub between those two sounds that works. And you don't necessarily notice, like, it's perceptual things, but you don't notice the snare is bright when the snare's dark. But as soon as you turn the hi-hat on, the snare is bright.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't need more top end. But if you soloed it and not EQ'd the snare on its own, it's too dark and you'd add top. And it's those sort of perceptual things that happen in the brain where you solo things are really dangerous. But to show you the information that might be there between elements that, you know, almost like an interrogation of what are these two things doing together? Oh, they are fighting a bit. Well, I can look at that, but I don't have to see it. I don't have to hear it. You can just see it, I should say.
I like that. I like that as another analysis tool almost.
Yeah, I was trying to be a musical analysis tool that you can turn off, that doesn't distract you from just listening, because listening is where it happens. You know, faders, balance, judging everything as one thing. Especially if you're tracking, you know, soloing stuff and tracking is like it's great for checking noise, but it's also like a dangerous path to walk because you don't necessarily know in sound check that you've got everything gelling, and then you go, right, let's roll a take, see where we're at, and of course you had a great kick drum and a great snare, but suddenly the snare is totally wrong for the song because you didn't check it all out with everyone playing, you know.
I think
so
studio
dangerous.
engineers could learn a lot from live engineers, from front of house engineers, because generally when a front of house engineer is building up a mix, let's face it, we all start with drums. They generally do. They won't go, here's my kick drum, and take it back down again. They'll leave the kick drum up, and then they'll build. They won't go, well, the kick drum sounds great on its own. Let's take that down. Snare drum, that sounds great on its own. Because it's an addition, it's an additive process, it's not a singular process.
Yeah, and there's a lot to be said for starting with your overheads, so that's the picture of the kit, and then filling in from there. I mean, you can go either way, can't you? But leaving stuff up and making sure it's up and checking phase and stuff is crucial.